Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're covering the Llenas case. Aybar, a very well-known story in the Dominican Republic that marked an entire generation and that you all have been asking me to cover for years. And with good reason. Honestly, you have every reason to ask for it, because it's shocking in the worst way. The case we're going to talk about today happened in the Caribbean region, in Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic. A place that, in recent years, has become the destination of choice for hundreds of thousands of people to spend their vacations. A beautiful area with amazing beaches, perfect for relaxing. Economically, wealth was concentrated in a small number of people, while between 40 and 60% of the population of the Dominican Republic lived below the poverty line. They didn't have access to basic services, and if they did, those services were very poor. Quite the opposite was true for the close circles of those in power at that time, such as Ileana del Carmen Aybar Nadal, who was the second cousin of Jacinto Quinado Garragosa, a politician who, at the time of these events in 1996, was the vice president of the nation. Ileana's husband, Jose Rafael Llenas Menacucci, also had his own notable connections, being a distant nephew of the well-known baseball player Winston Llenas, as well as the second cousin of Hipólito Mejia, who a few years later would become the elected president of the Dominican Republic. Even though they were not directly related to those in power, those connections meant a certain status that was maintained thanks to the considerable amount of money the family had. That level of wealth, far above the poverty line, allowed them to live a comfortable life and be known as a wealthy family. Unfortunately, we don't know much about the history of the Llenas family. Aybar. We don't know how they met or exactly when they got married. The only thing we know is that in 1984, the couple Ileana and Jacinto welcomed their only son, whom they named Jose Rafael, just like his father. At the time of the events, in May 1996, Jose was only 12 years old, so there isn't much we can say about him. Like any child, he went to school, and according to his parents and relatives, he was a cheerful and friendly boy. Sometimes he was even a little too innocent, which probably played a role in his disappearance. Both his mother and father worked in the afternoons, when Jose got out of school. He would come home alone, where he had some time to himself, before his parents returned from their offices. It was an arrangement the family had for some time, ever since Jose was old enough to stay home alone for a couple hours. And since then, there hadn't been any kind of problem. Jose followed to the letter the rules his parents had set for him, like not opening the door to strangers and calling one of his parents at the slightest inconvenience. Friday, May 3rd, 1996, seemed like just another ordinary day. Jose went back home, and on the way, he ran into Mario Jose Redondo Llenas, his cousin, 7 years older, who lived right across the street from his house. Mario, who was quite a bit older at 19, called his cousin over and asked if he wanted to go with him and some friends to a motorcycle show being put on by a local supermarket, not far from their house. Jose loved motorcycles, but he knew he couldn't go without asking for permission. First, he had to ask his mom, so he went inside the house and called her at work. He called his mom to talk to her. It was around 3:20 in the afternoon when Elena got the call from her son. Excited, Jose explained that his older cousin had invited him to the exhibition, although he admitted that his cousin had asked him not to say anything, since he didn't want Aunt Nora, Jose's father's sister, to know where they were going. At that moment, for Ileana, that didn't really catch her attention, and she decided to give her son permission to go with Mario to the exhibition. Her only condition was that Jose be home before 5 p.m. when she got off work, since they already had something planned, a task they needed to do together. Jose happily agreed and hung up to meet his cousin. That would be the last time Ileana spoke with him. Her cell phone rang a little after 5, But it wasn't her son, it was Mario. According to her husband's nephew, while they were coming back from the exhibition, Jose asked him to drop him off at the bowling alley where some friends were. This took Ailana by surprise. Her son hadn't mentioned anything about meeting up with his friends. And Jose was a very obedient and honest boy, so he usually didn't do things without telling his parents. Even more so, considering he had a plan that required him to come home early. It was something he had already agreed on beforehand, so suddenly it was very strange for him to disappear and decide to go to the bowling alley with other friends. Confused, Ailiana got into her car and, instead of heading home from work, she went to pick up her son at the neighborhood bowling alley. She parked the car and got out to look for Jose, but her son wasn't there. Worried, she got back in the car and headed to the supermarket, where her son had told her the exhibition was taking place. But when she arrived, she didn't see any signs, there was no one waiting, and no trace of any event related to motorcycles. In fact, such an event had never existed. Growing more and more worried, the woman searched all 3 floors of the supermarket several times without finding a single trace of her son. Before 6 in the evening, Ileana returned home, hoping that Jose had arrived while she was out looking for him, but that wasn't the case. She quickly tried to get in touch with her husband, and when she couldn't reach him, she called her cousin, Guillermo Moncada Aybar. Ileana would begin the search with him, since her husband was away on a business trip. That story, which started with a motorcycle exhibition, was falling apart. And the only person who might know what had happened was Mario, Jose's cousin. Over the next few hours, Jose's mother tried several times to get in touch with Mario, but he didn't answer his cell phone. It wasn't until 8:20 p.m. that he repeated that he had left his cousin in the parking lot of the bowling alley, where Jose had approached 2 boys his age and a man who, judging by his uniform, seemed to be a driver. Immediately, Ileana, along with some family members and friends, went there to look for him, but Jose was still nowhere to be found. On the way back, they ran into Mario, who joined the search for his cousin, and when they still couldn't find him, in fact, it was Mario who went with Ileana's cousin to a police station to file a report about the child's disappearance. At the same time, other relatives who had gathered to help made sure to print around 50,000 flyers with Jose's photo. And the word missing. Meanwhile, Ileana was contacting the media to spread the news and send them a photo of her son in an attempt to get more coverage and hopefully some information about the boy's whereabouts. By Saturday, May 4th, several newspapers had printed all the information about Jose and his disappearance on their front pages that day. However, at 7 a.m. that day, a couple of farmers from Pedro Brand, a rural municipality 24 kilometers from the city of Santo Domingo, made a horrifying discovery. In the Lebron stream, located northwest of the country's capital, they saw a pair of feet sticking out of the water. As they got closer, they discovered the lifeless body of a boy, almost completely submerged in the stream. He was completely wrapped in duct tape, and both his feet and hands were tied. A single glance made it clear he had been the victim of an extremely violent attack. He had dozens of stab wounds on his back and a deep cut on his neck. They counted a total of 34 stab wounds. When the body was pulled from the water, the police confirmed that it matched Jose's physical characteristics. He was also wearing the same clothes his cousin said he last saw him in, so the body was identified immediately and transported to the city of Santo Domingo. That same day, the boy's family held his wake there. It's worth mentioning that Mario attended. At this point, Mario had first said that his cousin left with some friends. Then, he said he left with some people he didn't know and with an older man. He joined the search and later went to the wake. By that time, Mario and his uncle, Jose's father, had been fighting. However, given the extremely difficult time the family was going through, the young man approached his uncle and hugged him tightly, telling him that all their differences were now resolved. No one in the family could have imagined that the cousin, who had seemed so concerned from the very beginning, had anything to do with what had happened. The connection started to be made on Sunday, May 5th, when Jose's body was taken to the Santo Domingo morgue to undergo an autopsy. We need to pause here for a moment because this is a huge mistake in a police investigation. Instead of first examining the body and collecting all the evidence that might be on it, the body was first taken through all the preparations done at a funeral home. And let's remember that he had a bunch of stab wounds all over his body, so there were a lot of things that, so to speak, had to be filled in and covered up before presenting him to the family, which obviously erased information of vital importance from the body. As if that weren't enough, the clothes Jose was found in remained in police custody. But they were lost at some point. From the transfer of the crime scene to police custody, making it impossible to carry out any analysis on those pieces of evidence. Both elements are extremely important, absolutely relevant for the investigation of a murder that had happened under such strange circumstances. Without them moving forward, it becomes more difficult, and it was incomprehensible how Jose's clothes could have been lost as if it were just a random thing. Was it a cover-up carried out by people with connections and money, or simply police incompetence? We don't know. Beyond these not-so-minor mistakes in the investigation, the forensic experts did find a clue that would help solve the case quickly. The funeral home staff hadn't opened little Jose's hands, so the forensic doctors were the first to do so. In one of his hands, they found a small piece of paper with a phone number written on it. The event, which seemed straight out of a mystery novel, had a detail like this that really caught everyone's attention. Obviously, the investigators' focus shifted to finding out who that number belonged to. The detectives discovered that it belonged to Kimberly Caldas-Giraldez, whom the police immediately called in for questioning. Kimberly had an alibi for the time of the incident and insisted she didn't know why Jose had her number. She admitted she knew the guy thanks to her boyfriend, Juan Moline Rodriguez, an 18-year-old who everyone knew, because he was Mario's best friend. Mario, as I remind you, is Jose's cousin and the last person to see him alive. Immediately, the police began to suspect that connection and went to look for the friends at their respective homes. They brought them to the police station, where, right at the door and in front of dozens of cameras, they admitted to being responsible for little Jose's death. In the subsequent interrogation, Mario said he had been hired by his friend to kidnap and murder his cousin, Martín Palmas, son of Luis Palmas and Teresa Machado de Palmas. That's all. Or rather, none other than the Argentina ambassador to the Dominican Republic. And why did their names come up in the case? Really? Besides the fact that this guy mentioned them, why would it make sense for their names to be connected to this? Because the stream where the body was found was on a property owned by the Palmas Machado family. It was just too easy to make that connection. This accusation led the press and the general public to start speculate about a satanic cult, dark magic rituals, among so many other theories that cast Mario and Juan as scapegoats, as somewhat unwilling accomplices. People were so convinced by this story that they even protested in front of the Argentine embassy, demanding that Teresa hand her son over to justice. However, the suspicions were never dismissed, since the diplomat claimed amnesty, which is nothing more than a legal pardon, and both she and her family left the Dominican Republic without even being questioned. Keep in mind that by that time, the press had hounded them with all kinds of accusations, not just for their possible involvement in this case, but also about other issues, like corruption or drug trafficking. Maybe these accusations were true, or maybe not. Either way, they decided to return to Argentina to get away from everything that was happening. This family left surrounded by security to prevent possible physical attacks because of the large number of threats against them. So there was always a question about the involvement of the family and Martín Palmas, especially since Juan Moline had said that he was his friend. It was even claimed that they had planned the kidnapping of another girl that didn't work out before Jose's case. Mario accused the Palmas family of planning future kidnappings, something he couldn't prove. He said that Luis Palmas had sexually abused him and that they made him take part in transporting a shipment of drugs. As for the Argentine side of the matter, Carlos Menem, who was president at the time, stripped Ambassador Matea de Palmas of her immunity on August 8, 1996. A week later, Leonel Fernandez took office as president of the Dominican Republic, and our then vice president, Carlos Ruckel, traveled there for the event. He was representing Menem. Ruckel said that if the courts requested the extradition of the Palmas, the government would not oppose it. In any case, the former ambassador had no further ties to the state. After this, she does not receive a state pension or have any political backing. Going back to the two suspects who were arrested, Juan Molin completely dismissed his best friend's story, telling a very different version in court. While Mario kept insisting that he had been pressured by the Argentine family, that Luis Palmas had forced him to take part in this satanic ritual in which Jose was the sacrifice, Luis, defending his son, said that he wasn't even in Santo Domingo when the crime happened. Juan, the other accused, completely denied having acted under pressure from others, and instead gave a detailed account of what happened on May 3rd. In court, Molineux stated that he and his friend had spent several weeks before the events planning the kidnapping of little Jose, with the goal of obtaining a multi-million-dollar ransom from his parents' letters. His parents. It was Mario who came up with the idea to trick his cousin into leaving the house. He knew his younger cousin loved cars and motorcycles, so he invited him to this supposed exhibition. But instead of taking him there, he led him to his best friend's car. Together, the two young men tied up the boy and gagged him before putting him in the trunk of the car. According to the plan they had come up with, they were going to take Jose to Juan's house for about a week. However, while they were driving around in the car that same day, talking about their next steps, they realized their plan had a huge flaw. And if you've seen it before, you're already smarter than these two. Jose knew who they were, so if they let him go, he would be able to identify them and tell what had happened. So they needed to get rid of him. From the very beginning, those weeks they spent thinking about what they were going to do were useless because at no point did they realize the most obvious thing, that they could be recognized. They also didn't understand that clearly being caught for a murder would be much worse than admitting to the attempted kidnapping and facing the consequences of that crime. So they drove to kilometer 13 on the Duarte Highway, near the LeBron stream. Meanwhile, they were still arguing about what they were going to do with Jose. It was at that moment that Mario asked his best friend if he was up for killing the boy. Juan refused, so his friend forced him to take the boy out of the car and hold him while he did it. The 32 stab wounds, plus the 2 to the neck. They left the body in the stream and went back to Santo Domingo, where Mario immediately joined the search for his cousin, even though clearly he already knew where he was. Even though Mario kept insisting on his story about being pressured by the Palmas family, Molin's story seemed much more believable than his. Besides, things like this have happened several times before. This isn't the first case where someone tries to kidnap a person and then realizes that the victim might be able to identify them, and that's a problem. So in January 1977, the court concluded that both of them were responsible. Since he had confessed to stabbing the boy, Mario Redondo Llenas was sentenced to 30 years in prison, while Juan Molina Rodriguez received 20 years for being considered a necessary accomplice to the crime. In 2006, the legal teams for both men took the case to the Supreme Court, seeking some kind of change to their sentences. However, the convictions were upheld, and it was also ordered that Jose's parents receive $5 million in compensation. The following year, in June 2007, when he reached the halfway point of his sentence, Molineux applied for parole. But this request, as well as his next one in 2009, were both denied. Finally, Juan regained his freedom on May 5, 2016. His first public statement was to apologize and express remorse for what he had done. He said, "As you can see, I served my entire sentence." I did this hoping that by serving the full sentence, it would bring some peace and a bit of comfort to the people who were hurt by what happened. Mario, for his part, requested release several times. His last request was in 2013, and it was denied. The report details that he has antisocial personality disorder and describes him as a problematic and unstable person, which clearly played a major role in keeping Mario in prison, even though he has shown exemplary behavior and graduated as a lawyer during his sentence, which is about to end. Let's remember that good behavior and sentence reductions because of it, in the case of people who have committed murder, have brought us several tragedies, where those who were granted temporary release or certain freedoms ended up killing or trying to kill again. Mario Redondo Llenas is expected to be released in May of next year, in 2026, which clearly many people have found concerning. Something unfair for the crime he committed. There are still people who believe that he and Juan were only the executors of a plan devised by someone else. Some still believe that the Palmas family was behind what happened, considering that's why they fled without giving their statement, even though both Redondo Llenas and Moline admitted what they had done, and the second one denied anyone else's involvement in the crime. But anyway, what do you all think? Let me know down in the comments. I'm reading them. And that's the end of this video. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those platforms. And with nothing else to say, here's a new video, here's a recommended video, you can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.